Current events in real estate nationally. August is the month where the changes take place from the proposed settlement between NAR, the National Association of Realtors, and its class action lawsuit. So, starting at some point in August, it has to happen before August 17th, but different areas are going to have different start dates. There are changes that are going to affect you, the seller, and you, the buyer, and me, the broker. And there's going to be a lot out there floating around, probably some misinformation. I wanted to clarify this for you. If you are interested in learning more about the class action lawsuit, there's plenty of that online. NAR on its website talks about it. I'm not going to talk about it here. I want to talk about the changes and how they will affect you moving forward. So what does this all mean? First of all, that means that you, the seller, are no longer going to be required to pay both commissions, both the selling broker's compensation and the buyer's agent's compensation. Now you pay your broker's compensation. The buyer is going to pay the buyer's broker's compensation. What doesn't this settlement agreement mean? Well, it doesn't mean that you can't pay the buyer's broker's compensation. You can. Just a quick aside, it's important to know that this is not a law. This is not a national law or a state level law. This is something that has come about as a proposed settlement. It has yet to get court approval, but the changes are being implemented anyway here in August. And it is a requirement for the membership to the MLS database. That's what keeps me alive as a broker. I need access to the MLS database, and if I don't agree to these changes, I am going to get kicked out of my local MLS. So these changes are mandatory for us. The first thing that I want you to know is that I do believe that this is good for the buyer. It's good for the seller, and it is good for both brokers being involved. There's changes here that are important. They're long overdue. When we're talking about these changes, I want you to know that I'm not going to be talking about commission percentages. I'm not going to be talking about dollar amounts. Those are negotiations that take place on an individual level between me and my client. In this arena, what I'm going to be doing is trying to explain this as clearly to you, but without using those terms. We're going to use basic algebra terms. A plus C plus B equals X. It'll be clear. So the key points. Let's talk about what this means to the buyer first. For showing houses, this is going to change a little bit right up front. In order for me to show you a property, I have to get a signed agreement with you regarding my compensation for my services for you. I don't get paid up front. I get paid upon a successful closing. That doesn't change. But you do have to sign an agreement right up front. That is a change. There was always a disclosure out there, a broker's disclosure saying, I'm acting as a transaction broker in absence of a buyer's agency agreement. That still exists, but now it includes a compensation part B that says, I'm acting as a transaction broker for you, the buyer, but here's how I get paid, and you are obligated to pay me if we get to a successful closing. So you would sign that, or you would sign a buyer's agency agreement assigning me as your agent. Either one of those are acceptable, but it has to be done before we start walking through properties. Then we get to a point where you find a property that you like, and we are going to write the offer. Now, there's a change here too, because you as the buyer, you have agreed to a compensation amount X with me. You said, all right, I will pay you X. Now, you have the right in the offer to say, if the listing brokerage firm is offering to pay compensation for me, we reference that in the contract. Let's say the listing brokerage, if they're paying compensation, that is A for purposes of this contract, for this video. You also can say that the seller will pay part of my or all of my compensation. We're going to call that B. Listing brokerage firm A, seller B. You have the option C, that you will pay my compensation, part or all. So A, part or all of my compensation gets paid by the listing brokerage firm. B, part or all of my compensation gets paid by the seller. C, part or all of my compensation gets paid by you. You as the buyer, this is your offer. You get to choose which you would like. The key component here is A plus B plus C must equal X. X being my total compensation. It cannot go over that amount. It cannot go under that amount. It equals X. So we write the offer. The key with this is that in Section 29 of the Colorado contract coming out August 15th out here, Section 29 states, okay, you can check all three boxes. In that case, A plus B plus C equals X. Or you can check A and B, saying A plus B equals X, or A plus C equals X, or A equals X, B equals X, or C equals X. Any of those are acceptable as long as it equals X. That is your offer to the seller to buy the seller's property. The seller, if the seller agrees with your offer, then that becomes the compensation agreement for that transaction and that specific transaction. It will change on other transactions, but that is our agreement for that transaction. So the seller, I want to talk about it with you. How does this change for you? All right, so first of all, you are no longer obligated to pay both sides. That's great. But you might be asked to pay. And in a slower market, this is going to be very market dependent. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you and I are sitting down at a listing appointment and we're talking about strategies to get the highest price for you, one of them will be, do we offer compensation to the buyer's broker as part of the sale? It would come through what you agree to pay me and then what I agree to pay to the buyer's broker. That's A. Me as the listing broker, A paying the buyer's broker. That's going to be an important component because you can absolutely believe that once this it gets instituted for us here locally August 15th, when we put your place on the market, every single broker that wants to show it will contact me ahead of time to say, are you offering compensation for my services? And if so, how much? It's not so that they know how much they're getting paid because they already know they're getting paid X. This is so that they can tell their buyer how much the buyer is going to be on the hook if the seller doesn't agree to pay and the buyer wants to buy your property. The buyer wants to know how much is it, just the same as the buyer wants to know what's the asking price on your property. This is a financial consideration for the buyer. So we are going to talk about that, and we are going to decide if you would like to offer compensation through the brokerage firm to the buyer's broker so that we get buyers that are more interested in it. By more interested in it, it's fairly obvious. It's the same idea as lowering the price is going to interest more buyers than a higher price. So it's important to keep that in mind. This is no different. When we get an offer on your property, this is a negotiable item. This is no different than negotiating the price, negotiating seller concessions towards the buyer's closing costs. No different than negotiating if the buyer wants you to pay for a rate buy down on the interest rate. If the buyer is asking you to pay B, a portion of the buyer's broker's compensation, it's going to show up in that contract offer, and then you get to decide what you want to do with that. Now, the thing to keep in mind, buyers and sellers here, is that different markets are going to have different outcomes. If you remember back 2021, the market was crazy. It was crazy nationwide. Out here in Colorado, you could offer 10% over asking price and you'd get laughed at. You wouldn't even be in the top 3. You needed to offer 15, 20% over asking price. You needed to waive inspection issues. You needed to cover any gap in appraisal. So if it appraised less because you were paying a crazy amount higher, you agreed to pay that extra as part of the down payment. I've had buyers during that time that offered a signing bonus to the seller, said, here's a check, thank you for accepting my offer. This isn't part of the earnest money, this isn't part of the purchase price, this is your money, go spend it, have fun. That's a different market, and if we get back to that market, you can rest assured that the buyers will not be checking box B on section 29 of the offer saying, we would like you to pay our broker's compensation. No, the buyer's going to pay the broker's compensation at that point. But they're also paying 10 or 15 or 20% over asking price. The market that we have right now is different. It is a slower market. It is more of a buyer's market. That means that right now I would anticipate that the buyer will check box A and box B. We would like to have the listing brokerage firm pay whatever they're offering, and we would like you, the seller, to pay the remainder to equal X. Or maybe they'll say part A, part B, part C equals X. But you can be pretty positive they're going to be asking for that in this slower market because they're also negotiating price. They're also negotiating terms. So this is just something that we just need to be aware of where we are in our market and what that means for you as the seller. So, key points to this. 1, the buyer is now responsible for payment of the buyer's broker's compensation. 2, the buyer must sign an agreement with the buyer's broker prior to looking at properties. 3, the buyer's broker's compensation is a negotiable item in the contract to buy and sell between the buyer and the seller. And for all compensation, whether the listing broker or whether the buyer's broker, is always negotiable. These are the things to keep in mind as we move through this in August. No matter what else you hear out there, this is what it means to you, the seller, to you, the buyer. Thanks so much for listening to me.